America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker.
And I'm Jordan Bruno.
And you can subscribe to the show on salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. Today, we're going to be joined by Dustin Meyer of the American Petroleum Institute. Dustin is the Senior Vice President of Policy, Economics, and Regulatory Affairs, leading API's public policy departments and overseeing the organization's economic research and regulatory functions. Dustin, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Jordan. Great to be with you guys today.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, for sure. So energy is really important to our small business owners across the country. We do a national poll of small business owners across the country every single month. And we've talked to them about energy, domestic drilling. We've talked to them about increasing domestic drilling. They're very much behind it. We've also talked to them about some of these EV mandates. And most recently, our poll came back and said that 70% of our small business owners are against mandates. Now, we like to extrapolate that to not just EV mandates, but all mandates. They're not. They know how the sort of trickle down effect is to them, and it's such a disproportionate negative impact. So we tend to see big numbers there. But energy is kind of the root of everything in our country, and so the high cost of energy has really impacted our small businesses over the last 3 years. Tell us about this new rule and how it's going to impact, sort of consumers overall.
Yep. Yeah. So the new rule that you're referring to is the one that was announced last week from the Environmental Protection Agency that we refer to as the tailpipe rule. And that sets mileage and efficiency standards for new automobiles starting in the year 2027. Now, these general rules have existed for a couple of decades, but what makes this one unique is just how unprecedented it is in scope. Right? Historically, under administrations of both parties in the past, they will come out with new standards that call for a modest increase in fuel efficiency, right? How can we do more with less and reduce pollution and coming out of the tailpipe? What makes this one different is that for the first time, you have an administration whose tailpipe rule is calling for a de facto ban on the most common type of vehicle, which is the internal combustion engine, right? And so that's why we and so many others view this regulation as a de facto ban on the internal combustion engine and a de facto mandate for electric vehicles, right? Now, to be perfectly clear, we fully support electric vehicles. We recognize that consumer demand for them in some parts is growing. And for a lot of consumers, EVs make a lot of sense. But it should be up to the consumer. They should have the choice. Right now, they should have more choice, not less. This rule really removes that choice. And that's why we and so many others are concerned with this unprecedented step that they're taking.
Yeah, this just seems like a real radical rule, real departure from just a few miles a gallon extra that we've seen, as you said. What are the implications for ordinary families across the country trying to contend with this?
Yeah, so specifically what this rule would require is by the year 2032 or 2031, almost 68% of new vehicles sold in America in that year have to be either EVs or plug-in hybrids. Now, as a reminder, right now, last year, EV sales are just a little bit less than 8% of new sales. And in terms of the overall automobile fleet, it's less than 2%, right? So going from 8% all the way to 68% in just a couple of years is a huge lift. But the auto manufacturers are going to have to comply with this rule, right? I mean, it will be the law of the land unless it is overturned. And therefore, they're left with a very difficult choice, which is how do we actually meet what consumers are demanding, which is vehicles of all sorts, including larger vehicles, including vehicles with internal combustion engines, yet still meet these almost mandate guidelines. That's going to be really difficult. It's going to mean that in a couple of years, when you go out and look for a new vehicle and you go to the vehicle dealership, you don't really know if what's going to be on the lot matches what you're interested in buying, because they are less concerned with what the consumer wants and more concerned with what the government requires. And that's where you get the disconnect. And that's where the choice starts to be eliminated from the consumer, right? Consumers right now, again, I mean, EV sales are increasing, but consumers have a lot of very justifiable concerns about the attributes associated with EVs. Again, there's a demographic of consumers in which electric vehicles make perfect sense, right? If you have a detached garage, if you drive fewer than 30, 40 miles per day, an electric vehicle might make all the sense in the world for you. But if you talk to small business owners, people from more rural parts of the country where you're driving more miles per day, maybe you're required as part of your work to carry heavier loads and things like that, EVs, especially in their present manifestation, just don't make a whole lot of sense. And so consumers have these very valid concerns. This rule more or less ignores those concerns and is just forcing one specific technology option on the whole panoply of the consumer.
A stat that really jumped out to me is that approximately 50%, from what I've read, is approximately 50% of non-Tesla EV purchasers return to internal combustion engines after that purchase, which is a lot lower uptake than you'd think for something growing this fast. So what in your experience and your research is holding consumers back from really falling in love with this new technology?
Well, that's a good point, Jordan, is, I think that underpinning a lot of these assumptions that, consumer adoption of EVs is only going in one direction and it's going straight up and that's the market at work. When you actually look at a lot of the data, you see statistics like that where, some folks try out an EV for a couple of years and for many of them, it works and they say, oh, I love this car and I'm going to get another one. But there is also a lot of consumers who experience it and say, it has its upsides, but it also has its downsides. And it prevents me from doing some of the things that I want to do and participating in the lifestyle choices that I really want to participate in. It's a reminder that some of those assumptions, which is that the world is inevitably moving in one direction, and that is towards widespread EV adoption, may not actually be the case, right? And when you don't know these things, that is what markets are for. Markets are best positioned to make that decision and solve that outcome as opposed to government regulators, right? And that's just where we get so concerned with this misguided approach to remove consumer choice. I would add that this is one rule, right? This is the EPA tailpipe rule for light duty and medium duty vehicles. We expect that tomorrow, which is Friday, this might be dated by the time it's posted, but Friday, March 29th, they're going to introduce a similar rule for heavy-duty vehicles that will require about 50% of those to be EVs by 2032. Now there, at least on the light and medium duty side, a lot of these vehicles do exist. It's really just a question of, do consumers really want them in the amount that would be required to meet these requirements, right? When you start talking about the heavy duty rule, that's where you're talking about semis and really large, heavy vehicles. And in many instances, those alternative choices, those EV choices, they really don't even exist yet. They certainly don't exist at the scale that would be required to get anywhere close to meeting a 50% target. So that rule, which probably won't get as much attention because it's not as consumer facing, that rule is in many ways almost more extreme than what the light and medium duty rule is. So that's something to watch as well. The final, in the final analysis, what this represents is a really unprecedentedly heavy hand for the U.S. federal government in the automobile market.
Aside from the consumer response, we're seeing the auto industry start, or before the rule came out, starting to say, hey, can you tap the brakes on this? Because we're not selling these. People can't, people don't want them. We saw auto workers when they were on strike last year. I mean, these workers, they understand the writing on the wall for jobs in the future. And we saw dealers come together and send a letter to the administration saying, we can't get people to test drive them. So aside from like the consumer part, and that the automakers are sort of waking up too late to this, because they were really on this, they were really on board with this until their consumers said, we're not. Since the consumer rules the day, here we are. But the other side of it is the infrastructure. I mean, how on earth is there an infrastructure going to just be born in 8 years that can support this kind of mandate?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's exactly right. And among other things, you're right that the dealers, their voices here are so important because they're the ones who are closest to the consumer. They're the ones who are having conversations with consumers, potential buyers on lots all across America, right? And so when they come out and say, hey, we are just really concerned about the pace of this. We talk with consumers every day. They have a lot of concerns. The government should really, really listen to them and not ignore them. I do think that lacking of infrastructure is such a big part of why consumers have this reticence towards adopting EVs, right? I mean, once you get outside of the best case scenario, right, for owning an EV is if you have a garage where you can have your own EV charger and you can charge your vehicle there overnight, right? And if you have that, again, an EV might be a great choice for you, right? But there are millions and millions of Americans who don't have that. I live in Washington, D.C. I live in the city. I live in a row house. I don't have that. I park my car on the street. How would I charge my EV on the street? There's a lot of other folks who just travel farther afield. And as you know, once you get into a different city, it's not your home market. You don't know where these EV chargers are, and there's not enough of them, and it makes it a very dicey proposition for a lot of consumers. And so I think that the consumers are speaking very loudly here. I think the dealers are speaking very loudly. I think the automakers are starting to get a sense of the challenges that this rule proposes, and the only one who's really not waking up to the realities of the marketplace is the EPA.
We see the tax subsidies that the government gives to incentivize consumers to buy them. Obviously, those aren't working, but it's just another example of the government distorting the market instead of allowing consumer choice. I actually come out of the auto industry. I worked for Chrysler when it was Daimler Chrysler. So I'm pretty familiar with the CAFE standards and going through all this process and everything like that. But I just think that these EVs should be subject to the same market forces that any other product is, and they should have to compete in the marketplace of ideas for those consumer dollars. And then what's worse about the rebates is that they're still selling these EVs at a loss on top of everything else. So taxpayers are losing twice.
Yeah, right. Well, and a lot of times, unfortunately, the business model, and you know more about the auto manufacturers than what I do, but a lot of times the business model is that, well, if you're going to lose money on the EV sales, the only way you can make it up is by charging more on your gasoline-powered vehicles, right? So if consumers are wanting those sorts of vehicles, not only do they have the government spending to drive the EV adoption, but they get hit by forcing themselves to pay more for a vehicle than what they otherwise would, right? For an F-150 or an F-250 or a Chevy Silverado, which, again, I mean, that's a useful reminder as well. If you just, look at where the marketplace is and what consumers want to buy, it remains the case and has been the case for many decades that the three most popular vehicles in America by far is the Ford F-150, the Chevy Silverado, and the Dodge Ram, right? I mean, it's not even close. This is what Americans want. And if you're forcing them only to have EV options, it's just a really not a realistic view.
Yeah, that's something Elaine has written on before. I mean, it's really par for the course with this worldview of governing. When you look at health insurance or student loans, I mean, the idea of massively subsidizing one end And then the other end just becomes so much more expensive, whether it's us trying to get our health insurance or the poor kids in college coming in dealing with these high tuitions. So without getting too contrarian, I mean, I've read a bunch of studies recently suggesting that maybe EVs aren't all they're cracked up to be environmentally. One that I saw was that the heaviness of EVs mean the more tire erosion can create increase in particulate pollution, which is much more dangerous than just pure carbon emissions. And then there's also the aspect of where we're plugging our cars into a grid that's powered often by coal and oil as well. I guess my question would be, has the environmental benefits of EVs been overstated in your view?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think the understanding of the full life cycle analysis of these different technology options is starting to deepen. And I think there is a little bit more skepticism as to, okay, there might be a benefit from an emissions perspective of EVs versus internal combustion engines, but is that benefit as great as what we've been led to believe? And I think especially when you look at the perspectives or the preferences of the marketplace, which, as I said, what do at the end of the day American consumers want? The trend is they want bigger vehicles, they want safer vehicles. And what you see even on the EV side of the market is that there are more and more EV models that are being made available. That's a good thing. Again, consumers should have more choice, but especially what they're doing is those EV vehicles are getting bigger, right? So you have more SUVs that are EVs that are made available. Well, once you get into those heavier vehicles, right, the amount of battery capacity that you need is really quite significant. Not only do they become just enormous vehicles and very, very heavy, but that life cycle analysis perspective from an emissions, the benefit starts to narrow a little bit. So that's an important thing to consider as well. There's a big difference of, sure, if you're comparing a Ford F-250 to a Nissan Leaf, right, the emissions benefit will be significant. But if you're comparing an F-250 to a similarly sized, similarly capable electric vehicle, that benefit might be smaller than what a lot of people would think. So that's a really important consideration of this. And it's yet another example of, like, well, these are issues that the market is best placed to decide. You just can't, as a government right now, look 7 years into the future and predict what consumers are going to want, what the technology is really going to look like. There's a lot that's happening. I mean, I think that there's underpinning a lot of this is this assumption that, well, we've maxed out all of the efficiency gains that you could get from a standard internal combustion engine, be it gasoline or diesel, right? And that's not the case. In fact, we've seen this over the last 40 years that traditional gasoline-powered engines continue to get more and more efficient, and we would expect that to continue going forward. There's a lot of ground that can be made as well in terms of working with different fuel blends to decrease the overall carbon intensity of the gasoline or the diesel that you're using in that more efficient gasoline engine, right? So there is an alternative trajectory here that is possible, but this rule is so stringent and so extreme that it really ignores that pathway and is just, it comes down to picking winners and losers here, which is just never a good thing for the government to be doing.
Talk to us about the national security implications of this.
Yeah, so, you had mentioned this off the top of just where we are in terms of energy dominance in the United States. We're by far the world's largest oil producer. We're by far the world's largest natural gas producer. We're now one of the world's largest exporters of both of these products. That's a really good thing. It's brought more stability to the global marketplace and has kept prices a lot lower than what they presumably otherwise would be. But when it comes to EVs, those fuel sources, those technology sources are very, very different. And in this instance, that supply chain is overwhelmingly dominated by just a few countries, and and by far the largest, most dominant force is China, right? So if you're moving to an EV dominated future, at present, a lot of those rare earth materials, a lot of the battery manufacturing, it comes from China. Now, there are some provisions in some recently passed legislation that are trying to force more of that manufacturing occurring here in the United States. But the reality is that we have a long ways to go. And so that is one of the real concerns, is that as we're forcing this shift, are we also forcing ourselves into a dependency that we really don't want to have? Right now, energy is one of those, China is a major importer of, American energy products, right? Natural gas, major importer of oil. And that's a good thing, right? That's leverage for us. It's a nice thing to have them be a little dependent on us for something that's so critical to their economy. Are we at risk of giving that up and nurturing instead our dependence on them? That has to be part of the consideration when the government is evaluating proposals for regulations such as this.
This seems like this executive overreach seems so broad that it seems to really violate what the Supreme Court has been questioning and ruled on with the major questions doctrine. Are you aware of any lawsuits to try to block this rule or at least fight it?
I think that there definitely will be legal challenges to this because of just how unprecedented it is, right? Nobody questions that the EPA has authority under the Clean Air Act to work to reduce emissions from the U.S. Transportation fleet, right? But do they have the authority to force a full-on shift from one technology to another? To force a shift from internal combustion engines, which right now are 98% of the total vehicle fleet, to electric vehicles? I think a lot of people would suggest that no, that is not what Congress intended when they granted them this authority under the Clean Air Act 50 years ago, right, when EVs weren't even a thing. So I think this is one of many instances in which this administration's approach and view on the reach of their regulatory authority may run afoul of the way that the courts have more recently started to look at that deference, right, at that discretion that they have. You saw this a couple of years ago with the West Virginia v. EPA case that was more on the power sector, right, but it kind of confronted some similar issues where, yeah, does the EPA have authority to reduce emissions in the U.S. power sector? Absolutely. Do they have the authority to transform the U.S. power sector? The Supreme Court said no. You wonder if they will be forced to answer similar questions on the transportation side.
So what is API doing to sort of bring awareness to the public? I assume you're a part of the comments leading up to the rule. Actually, let me rephrase that question because I assume you all were very involved in representing the industry throughout the comments part of this rule. Did the administration seek to work with you or focus on the needs of the industry and balancing it with the consumer, expectations and the consumer choices versus the environmental impact and their sort of green agenda that they're trying to push through?
Yeah, so we did submit comments, very voluminous comments that really laid out our perspective on how to best reduce emissions from the transportation sector. And we really encouraged EPA to take a different tact here. We pointed out the unrealistic timelines and what exactly this would mean in terms of demand for electricity, in terms of deepening dependence on foreign suppliers of batteries and other critical materials. We put all of that in the comments, and we were not alone. This was a pretty popular docket to file comments in because people understood the ramifications of this. And unfortunately, as the administration put out their final rule last week, it seems like most of our suggestions and many other suggestions were roundly ignored. You may have seen some headlines that, the EPA in the final rule softened some of the targets. They delayed the implementation. It's really a distinction without a difference. They end up in the same place as what they did in the proposal. They just ever so slightly changed the curve in the ramp rate to get there. So it's really a distinction without a difference and doesn't really in any meaningful way represent a softening or a compromise versus what the proposal was. This is still, at the end of the day, an unprecedented effort to mandate the sorts of vehicles that consumers can buy in America. And that's what our comments suggested in the proposal, and that has governed our reaction ever since. I think what's notable is that this is one of those regulations where, okay, now the final comes out and we review it and other groups and other parts of the industry review it and we put out our comments. And in this instance, hey, we think this is a bad policy. We think this is misguided. We'll consider all of our opportunities and options to push back on this rule. I think what's notable is that from the political side, there was a decent amount of bipartisan pushback, right, from the Democratic side. If you look at somebody like John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, right, I mean, he came out and said, hey, look, I completely understand the need to reduce emissions from the transportation sector, but this seems a lot. And I just don't know if that's where the American consumer is right now. And I agree, right? You just can't look at the trend lines over the last couple of years and have some trepidation over just the magnitude of the transformation that this would force in just a handful of years. So I think that's indicative of just how out of step a regulation like this is.
Thanks a lot. Can you just tell our viewers and listeners where they can find out more about API and the work you're doing?
Yeah, so absolutely. You can go to our website, www.api.org. As a reminder, API, the American Petroleum Institute, we represent the entirety of the U.S. oil and gas industry, everything from upstream producers to pipeline operators to refiners to LNG exporters. So really the entirety of the industry, and we work very hard to represent a unified voice. We have over 600 member companies, many of the names that you would recognize, some of the names that maybe you wouldn't recognize, but really the backbone of the U.S. energy dominance that we now have is the result of our industry. So we do a lot of work. This is a busy time given the amount of regulatory threats that we're under right now, but it's a great industry and one that we're proud to represent.
Dustin, what can Americans do, everyday ordinary Americans and our small business owners do to have their voices heard with this kind of government overreach? I mean, these are unelected bureaucrats.
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially as we move into an election year, energy is going to be on the ballot. And we're not a partisan organization. We have the same message to both parties, which is that we think that smart energy policy is good for America and is going to be popular with voters. And I think that this is a good opportunity for voters all around the country to ask their elected officials or those who want to be elected officials, what is your vision for America's energy future and how realistic is it and who stands to benefit and who stands to lose? We have a program called Energy Citizens, which I would absolutely encourage all of your listeners to sign up for. It gives them a lot of information about the key issues impacting our industry and gives them some insight as to the role that those issues are playing in different campaigns around the country. So I would absolutely encourage your listeners to check out Energy Citizens on API's website.
Great. Well, Dustin, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's Small Business Megaphone.
Well, thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Jordan. It was great to be with you guys.
Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday, and you can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. We'll see you real soon.